Peyturtle.
Ram? Ram from popular hit anime ReZero starting life in another world? What are you doing in my room?
Because you haven't uploaded a video in over 6 months. Any more slouching around playing that strange horse girl game and you'll become about as useful as Puck.
Puck? I'm not that much of a bum. Don't say that. Also, Unity 2.0 is out. Besides, what am I even supposed to make a video about?
You truly are useless. Can't even use your own head to come up with an idea.
Shut it. You're just a PNG.
No, I'm very much real.
Touche.
Now get to work and make a video and stop being lazy. If you need ideas, perhaps look directly in front of you.
At the monitor? The cardboard cutout? Oh! A video about you!
You are such a helper, you.
Don't talk to me like that.
Understood.
Now, fade the screen to black.
Why?
Because you're starting the video.
Right.
Speak.
What makes a character worth understanding? Is it seeing their kindness towards others, their heroism, the positive impact they have on the people around them? Or is it something else entirely? Because if those are the standards we use to determine whether or not a character is worth understanding, then understanding a character becomes easy. We naturally gravitate towards the people we admire, the people we agree with, the people whose actions align with our own sense of right and wrong. But the characters that often leave the strongest impressions aren't always the easiest to like. They're flawed, contradictory, sometimes frustrating, sometimes even cruel. Yet despite that, they are characters we continue trying to understand, and few characters truly embody that contradiction better than Ram from ReZero. For as long as I have been a fan of ReZero, Ram has remained one of the most divisive characters. Some view her as a deeply tragic and brilliantly written character who hides a lifetime of loss behind a nonchalant facade, while others see a cruel woman whose treatment of Subaru and devotion to Roswell make her difficult, if not impossible, to sympathize with. And honestly, I think both perspectives are understandable, because Ram isn't some character that has to be liked. Rather, she's a character that has to be understood. The problem I often see surrounding discussions about Ram begin and end with what she says rather than why she says it. So today, rather than asking the question of whether or not Ram is a good or bad person, I'd like to ask a different question. Why is Ram the way she is? And what happens when we look beyond the sarcasm, the pride, and the cruelty that defines her in most discussions? Hello everyone, my name is Peyturtle, a very consistent, inconsistent YouTuber, and we are going over something a little different this time around. Usually I'm doing deep dives into like video game stuff or radish ASMR, but today I thought it'd be fun to make a video on my favorite anime, ReZero, going over one of the most controversial characters in the show, especially as of late. So without any further yapping, let's take a closer look into Ram, and I'll be right back. Oh. Hopefully they didn't mess me up too much. Does it look all right, guys? Don't be nice to me. For those who haven't seen ReZero, first of all, why are you here? Seriously, go watch it. But for everyone else, or for those who need a quick refresher, let's talk about who Ram is. At a first glance, Ram is exactly what most people say she is. She's sarcastic, she's sharp-tongued, blunt to the point of being cruel, she rarely sugarcoats what she's thinking, and more often than not, Subaru ends up being on the receiving end of it. If you search for discussions about Ram online, especially as of the most recent season 4, you'll find the same criticisms come up over and over again. She's unnecessarily mean to Subaru, she's blindly devoted to Roswell, and she comes across as emotionally distant. And even when she does something good, it's easy for those moments to get overshadowed by either some insult that she throws 5 minutes later, or because of the words she speaks within that moment. For example, and spoilers for Arc 6 of ReZero, or Season 4 of the anime, this video will cover up to the end of Volume 23, or the episode 11 in Season 4, so yep, spoiler warning. Alright, when Subaru is about to get hit by the Hungry Horse King in the Miasma Cave, Ram covers him with her body so he doesn't get hit. And right after that, she gets back up to defend him once more, shielding him from the witch beast. Upon being asked why by Subaru, Ram responds, because Rem would cry. I think this is an important scene to bring up because I've seen a lot of discourse surrounding things like this. Some may view it as Ram only caring about her sister, Rem, while others may view it as her own way of motivating Subaru. And honestly, that difference in interpretation says a lot about how people approach Ram as a character. If all you look at is what Ram says and the decisions she makes on the surface, it's not difficult to understand why she's become one of the most divisive characters. But I also think that's where the discussion usually ends. Because while people spend a lot of time talking about what Ram does, I don't think we spend nearly as much time talking about why she does it. And for a series like ReZero, I think that distinction matters a lot more than people think. And so, I want to preface this by saying something first. I am by no means a psychologist. I'm just a guy making a video essay on a fictional character. But I think a lot of people need to remember that ReZero isn't just a fantasy isekai that doubles as a psychological thriller, rather as a character study, a dive into understanding oneself better, finding self-worth, identity, and learning to become a better version of yourself. Aside from our main protagonist in Subaru, arguably the most complex character in the Amelia camp, if not in the entire series, is Ram. Like I said before, it is easy to look at a person's mannerisms as means to define their character, but that doesn't often portray the full story. For example, let's take a look at Subaru. If you look at Subaru today, most ReZero fans would agree he is one of the most well-written characters in the series, let alone in all of anime. But if we only watched the show up until the point where he crashed out on Amelia in Arc 3, most people would look at him in a completely different light. A loser, a narcissist, maybe even a scumbag, despite knowing what he had to get through to get to that point. To the viewer, and especially to the people around him, he could be seen as a deadbeat person. His outburst during the royal selection, along with the way that he treated Amelia afterwards, is part of the reason why so many people dropped this show early on, and why it is one of the most worst reviewed episodes in the entire series. People naturally gravitate towards people that seem strong or kind, but for characters who are messy, insecure, and deeply flawed, it asks something different from us. They ask whether we're willing to keep watching. But because we have seen signs of Subaru at his lowest, and because we have seen signs of him at his best, it teaches us that his lowest moments aren't what define his character, but rather are just a part of what shaped him. You can apply the same concept to other characters. Julius, Beatrice, Amelia, Rem, Otto, and so on, and yet their flaws don't define them. It's just what shapes their character. It's just what makes them human. Every character starts off as one person, that is obvious, but then they become another after we understand them. ReZero rewards patience. The longer you're willing to sit with a character before deciding who they are, the more the series gives back. It consistently asks us to separate a person's worst moments from the entirety of who they are. So then, why is it so hard for Ram to get that same treatment? I kind of think it's simple. She's very hard to love. And this is where Ram becomes different from basically everyone else in the cast. Most people can agree that a character's lowest moments don't define them, but with Ram, that grace often disappears. People argue that Ram has always been this way, that there was never really a point where she grew beyond her emotional distance. And I believe that's where it's important to understand why Ram is the way she is, and why she is judged so differently from the rest of the cast. And this video is by no means a defense of Ram's actions. Some of her actions are genuinely hard to defend, but that's also part of what makes her so interesting. My goal of making this video isn't to convince you to like Ram. It's to better understand why she makes the choices she makes, and through her explore why ReZero's character writing resonates with so many people. And just to clarify, this isn't about excusing Ram's actions, or trying to argue that every criticism of her is invalid. I'm not trying to start some kind of argument. Like I said, that is not the point of this video. The point is, in a series like ReZero, context is kind of everything. And depending on how much of that context you're willing to engage with, the characters can look completely different. Because unlike many characters in ReZero, Ram isn't someone whose development is defined by visible growth over time. Instead, she's a character defined by what her behavior is built around. So if you only really ever look at the surface without understanding what's underneath it, she can very easily come across as emotionally flat, inconsistent, or even unnecessarily cruel. But the interesting part about all of this is that Ram isn't missing much context. The context is often just external to the moment that she's in. And to me, that's where the misunderstanding starts. Ram is first and foremost a character defined by loss, but it's not just in the simple sense of she had something bad happen to her. No, it's a lot more structural than that. Ram's identity is shaped by the removal of something that would normally define what she could have become. Her horn wasn't just the source of her strength. It represented an entire future that disappeared overnight when it was cut off. She's not introduced as someone in the middle of growth. Rather, she's introduced as someone in the aftermath of it, which creates a real interesting dilemma for interpretation. Because when a character is shown after their development arc, viewers may subconsciously assume that there was no development at all. They may assume that what they are seeing is who that character is really meant to be. So instead of seeing Ram as someone who arrived at the state through experience, she is often interpreted as someone who simply is this way by default. A large part of this comes about from the fact that Ram's emotional anchors aren't always visible. What I mean by that is that her actions don't always signal her internal reasoning in an obvious way. It helps to read things like the web novel or the light novel if you want to get more context behind certain characters' actions, as you may get actual descriptors of how the character is feeling in a given action. But with the anime, a lot of it has to be up to interpretation, viewing facial expressions, or tone of voice. But Ram is not a character who openly expresses vulnerability, and she rarely frames her actions in a way that makes it immediately accessible to other characters, or even the viewer. So it makes complete sense why people are only left to view what is left at the surface. That being sarcasm, dismissiveness, pride, and emotional distance. And when those traits are observed without their underlying context, they start to look a lot more like personality traits than coping structures. But then there's her sister, Rem, because part of Ram's emotional foundation is deeply tied to her. When Rem has her names and memories eaten by gluttony, Ram doesn't simply just lose the memories of her sister, but she loses the emotional context those memories provided. Rem isn't just a sister to Ram, but a reference point, a constant against which Ram's identity is measured, reinforced, and in many ways defined. And when that reference point is erased, Ram doesn't just become someone else entirely. Instead, she continues living in an absence that she can't fully explain. Because gluttony's authority doesn't just remove memories, but it severs relationships. We actually see how extreme this idea can become in stories like The Pride If, where characters are pushed to the absolute limit by the loss of someone central to their emotional world. In that version of events, Felix is in complete emotional ruin after the loss of his memories of Krush, which were lost to the white whale's fog, to the point where Subaru is willing to use his own life to stop Felix from killing himself due to the mental strain it puts on him, showing just how devastating the removal of a single foundational relationship can be. And while that is just an alternate scenario in ReZero, it helps illustrate a broader point of how fragile identity becomes when those reference points are erased. But even without going that far, Ram's situation demonstrates a softer version of that same principle. Thankfully though, Ram still had Roswaal to rely on, or else she could have ended up in that same state, though that is purely speculation. Anyway, Rem stops being someone Ram consciously remembers, yet that bond doesn't disappear entirely. It festers, continues to exist beneath the surface, influencing her in ways she struggles to explain. And that's important because it means that Ram's actions can seem contradictory if you only look at what she consciously knows, instead of what remains emotionally. Which means from the outside, her behavior can look inconsistent depending on what version of the context the viewer is working with. Not because Ram herself is inconsistent, but rather because the audience is constantly interpreting her with different pieces of information. And then there's Roswaal. If Rem represents emotional anchoring, Roswaal represents purpose. His role in Ram's life functions as hatred turned affection into something a lot more directional. It gave her a defined path of action in a world where her original trajectory was fundamentally disrupted. So when people interpret her loyalty to him in pure moral terms, it can appear as blind devotion or even a lack of agency. But from a structural perspective, it's a lot closer to replacement momentum, a way of continuing forward when her original sense of identity as the Oni god's successor is no longer accessible. In that sense, Ram is not simply a failed version of what she could have been, but someone whose path was rerouted entirely. She is not defined by what she is becoming, but by what she was able to continue doing after that becoming was interrupted. And this is where Ram becomes really difficult to evaluate compared to other characters in ReZero, because most characters are understood through visible transformation. You see their growth, you see their breaking points, you see their internal conflict unfold over time. But Ram is often encountered in what is effectively a post-transformation state, where the causes of her current behavior are not always present in the scene being judged. Because of that, she is frequently interpreted through isolated snapshots rather than a continuous arc. And that's exactly where the misunderstanding begins. Because if you only judge Ram through what she is doing at the moment, yeah, she can appear cold, detached, or unnecessarily harsh. But when those behaviors are understood as a larger part of a structure built from loss, displaced identity, and her externally anchored purpose, what looks like inconsistency starts to resemble continuity. Not justification, not redemption, just structure. And that distinction matters because it determines whether a character is being judged as a collective of moments or as a continuous identity shaped by context that isn't always immediately visible. So now comes the difficult part in this dilemma. Because everything I've said so far sounds reasonable when we're talking about broad ideas. Context matters. Identity is complicated. Characters should be understood as more than just their isolated moments. But theories and ideas only hold weight if they survive reality. And for Ram, that reality is Arc 6. Because if there was any point in this story where people really stopped trying to understand her, it was Arc 6. And this is where I see a lot of the criticism surrounding Ram exploded from. Not because she became a completely different person or anything, but because the traits that people disliked were pushed to their absolute limit. She continues to insult Subaru, appears to be emotionally distant, and perhaps most importantly, she repeatedly frames her concern for Subaru through Ram instead of Subaru himself. To pull back on the example at the very beginning of this video with the Hungry Horse King, she defends him from the attack, and instead of saying something along the lines of "I don't want to see you get hurt," we just get "because Ram would cry" as a response to why she was helping him. Another time we see Ram completely snap at an amnesiac Subaru after he tells her that he lost his memories. Instead of expressing concern for him, she begs him to tell her he's just joking around for the sake of Rem, pinning him against a wall. Then, right before Subaru's about to tell his party about his ability to return by death because he lost his memories and wants to try and help out, he overhears the party talking about him. Aridna points out that it might be too dangerous to keep him around, to which Ram agrees, even after everything they have gone through to get to this point, even though none of them know of the deaths he went through to make sure everyone got there safely. And then we get probably the most infamous scene that completely lit the flames under the Ram hate train, her saying "I feel bad for Rem" after Subaru had just gone through a complete mental breakdown. It's hard to watch. But lastly, Ram wanting to torture Subaru while he was trapped within Amelia's ice prison because she suspected him to be the Sin Archbishop of Lust, Capella. Does all of this sound incredibly surface level? Well, because it kinda is. But when I say this out loud, do you love Ram? Or do you think her actions are borderline cruel? But notice what's happening here. The debate almost immediately turns into, does Ram actually care about Subaru? I don't believe that to be the most interesting question to take away from all of this. Rather, the more interesting question is, why do people walk away from these same exact scenes with complete opposite readings? Because I don't believe that's accidental. There's reasons apart from there being, Ram haters and Ram defenders, that Ram has these low moments and is still loved and appreciated by people within the community. Ram is a character whose motivations are rarely stated in ways that are emotionally satisfying. She doesn't reassure people, she doesn't explain herself, and she almost never rewards the audience with obvious emotional payoff apart from gags. Instead, she usually says something sarcastic, blunt, or just emotionally detached, and expects the people around her to understand anyway. Because if you've already decided that Ram is cruel, every sarcastic line confirms it. Her wanting to torture Subaru in the ice prison just adds more fuel. She was acting completely rash, because we see moments after that Beatrice explains that she could just hold his hand to prove that he was the real Subaru, because the two of them are contracted, bounded by the soul. But if you've already accepted that her emotions are heavily internalized, those same lines start to sound very different. Not necessarily kinder, just different. And that's why I think Arc 6 became such a flashpoint. It isn't where Ram changes. Well, I mean, not entirely yet, at least, but where the audience is forced to determine how they are gonna view her moving forward. Now, nothing I said is trying to excuse Ram from these points of contention, nor does it make her right. Context explains behavior, but it doesn't erase responsibility, and that is an important distinction, because there are still many decisions Ram makes throughout Arc 6 that people strongly disagree with. So, before we can answer whether or not the criticism surrounding Ram is fair, we first need to ask another question. What did Ram do, and what did Ram mean? Because those aren't always the same question. Her actions are deserving of further recontextualization. Not to completely excuse her, but to see what is fair and what isn't. So, if Arc 6 is where understanding stops feeling easy, then this is where the framework actually gets tested. Because it's one thing to say context matters in the abstract, but it's another thing entirely when you start to apply that same logic to moments that, on the surface, look genuinely hard to defend. And this is where I believe Ram becomes one of the most interesting case studies in ReZero as a whole. Not because she's the most morally complex character in the traditional sense, but because her scenes constantly force you to decide how much context you're willing to accept before forming a conclusion. Because depending on what version of the story you're engaging with, the anime or the light novel, surface level, or full context, Ram can look like completely different interpretations of that same character. Take the ice prison scene. On a surface level, yeah, this is probably one of the most easiest moments to point at when criticizing her. She suspects Subaru as being an enemy. She reacts aggressively and even goes as far as proposing torture as a means of extracting information about his identity and Mei's whereabouts. And if you isolate that moment, it absolutely reads as extreme, but the situation around it matters as well. Because prior to this, Subaru had just previously been in a position where he was actively rushing to attack Ram. Mei is dead, and from Ram's perspective, she is dealing with someone who she believes to have taken the face and voice of Natsuki Subaru in an environment where hesitation could mean death. Even Beatrice holding his hand as a verification method only really works because of hindsight. I mean, think about it. If Subaru really was Capella, would Ram be blamed for acting rash if Subaru ended up killing Beatrice? Probably not. So the question shifts from is torture acceptable here to something a lot more uncomfortable. What kind of situation makes that reaction the only available option? It doesn't erase the severity of the action by any means, but it certainly changes what kind of action it is. Well, let's take a look into the I feel bad for Rem scene. And like I said, probably the most infamous scene to criticize her for, and for good reason. On its own, it's extremely difficult to interpret charitably if we only take Subaru's perspective into account, but the context around it is doing a lot more of the work than the line itself. At that moment, Subaru is not presenting his suffering in a straightforward emotional way. He is not fully breaking down in the anime version of events in the same manner he does in the light novel, where at least in there is a fractured attempt at levity from his part, as if he's trying to laugh off the weight of what is happening to him because there is nothing else left to do. Ram isn't reacting to Subaru as a fully isolated person in this moment. And there are some very interesting bits of information that get brought up here in the narration that is removed from the light novel, and I'd like to take a look at it. He had been taken back to the green room and left there to wait for new developments. Because she couldn't leave her precious sister with Subaru like that, Ram had taken her twin out of the room. Poor Rem. So in the light novel, it seems like Ram is doing Subaru more of a decency by not letting Rem see him in such a state. While in the anime, it comes across as a whole lot more cruel. And this is where the interpretation problem starts becoming unavoidable. Her comment is not just directed at Subaru, but at the situation as a whole, filtered through her inability to process what is happening right in front of her. Is it still a cruel thing to say in hindsight? Yes, absolutely. That doesn't really go away. But what changes between interpretations is whether you read the scene as deliberate emotional dismissal or emotional misalignment due to stress. But we also have the party discussion scene, where Subaru overhears Ram and the others evaluating whether he should be treated as dangerous or if he will slow them down. And to me, this is where anime and light novel interpretations start to matter a whole lot. Because in the anime, Ram's comments read much more blunt, a pragmatic dismissal of Subaru as basically a burden given his state. It's cruel, simple, and final. But in the light novel, there is a whole lot more texture to it. Let's look. So this is in response to Ridna about Subaru being unreliable and that it might not be safe to bring him with them. Is it safe to assume that you are saying this less out of concern for Barusu's safety and more out of a belief that he would weigh us down? If so, I am in agreement. And then responding to Amelia, she continues, I merely stated an objective truth. Or do you really believe you are capable of working with Barusu just the same as yesterday now that he doesn't have his memories, Lady Amelia? I acknowledge that Barusu is not a bad person. But if you asked me whether I could trust a Barusu who is a blank sheet, then I would say no. There is no reason to. It was cold logic, but at the very last bit, it sounded like Ram was holding back a bitter taste. I mean, it feels like a complete difference from how it is portrayed in the anime. There is hesitation here, recognition, because it's now no longer just Subaru is a liability. It becomes more like I don't know how to evaluate someone who has changed without me being able to track how. Those are definitely not the same statements and are worth considering when taking into account Ram's actions and the things she says. And finally, there is the moment where Ram pins an amnesiac Subaru to the wall and breaks down verbally. This is probably the clearest example of why reducing her to surface level reactions completely just misses the point. Because this is not Ram acting from a position of control. It is Ram losing control. Just like what we saw with the ice cave, Ram clearly trusts Subaru. But that is what makes the situation worse, not better, because if she didn't, there would be no conflict. But because she does, his instability hits completely different. And layered on top of what is already her strenuous physical condition, her incomplete recovery, and the ongoing strain of everything tied to Roswell in her horn, it's easy to see that she is not acting in the right state of mind. So what comes out is not clarity, but emotional overload. Not calculated cruelty, but fracture under pressure, which does not make any of this right. That's the most important thing. All of it does is make it readable in a different way. And that's really the point of all of this. Because once you start laying these scenes next to each other, something becomes abundantly clear. Ram is not a character who changes depending on the scene itself. Rather, she is a character whose internal state is rarely visible in the scene itself. That means interpretation is dependent on how much weight you give to what is said versus what is left unsaid. Whether you take in completely how she is portrayed in the anime, or whether you take into how she is portrayed in the light novel. And that's where the real split happens. Not between people who believe her to be completely excusable with all of her actions versus people who think she is the worst character ever, but between people who are willing to treat missing emotional context as meaningful and people who only value what is explicitly shown. And neither of these approaches is automatically correct, but they do lead to completely different versions of that same character. I can probably get into more examples of recontextualizing Ram's actions, but I feel like that would turn a lot more into just a Ram defense video if I did that. So I'm just gonna leave it here. I think that it's a good start though. So if you plan on rewatching ReZero, or if you care about looking into characters like Ram into a lot more detail, then you can do this kind of thinking exercise. That really, it sounds like I'm really just trying to be a therapist, but these themes surrounding her character will just get more and more present the further in you get. And I believe that is what makes her such a compelling character. So, what makes a character worth understanding? I don't think it's kindness or heroism, or even whether they're easy to like. I think it's whether they're written in a way that asks us to look beyond our first impression. Ram's cruelty doesn't exist in a vacuum. Neither does her pride, and neither does her loyalty. But whether or not those qualities make her someone you like is entirely up to you. Because just like Subaru, just like Otto, just like Julius, and just like Rem, those moments aren't what define them, and they aren't what define Ram either. They are just a part of what shaped her. And understanding that distinction, I believe, is one of the reasons that ReZero continues to resonate with so many people. Because it teaches us how to interpret people. It asks us to understand people before deciding who they are. It asks us just how much patience we're willing to give someone before deciding who they are. But more than that, it also asks us something else. How much of a person do we actually see at any given moment? Because depending on the version of the story you're engaging with, or even the angle a scene is framed from, the same character can feel completely different. Some of Ram's moments feel cold and detached on a surface level reading, but gain additional weight when you factor in what is said offhand, what is internal, or what is simply not emphasized in certain adaptations. And that difference changes not what she does, but how those actions are interpreted. So whether or not you like Ram isn't the point. It's whether or not you can come to a conclusion on how much you desire to understand her, or any given character for that matter, before deciding to make a decision. Because in the end, how we feel about Ram may say less about her and more about how willing we are to sit with someone we don't immediately understand. After all, if a girl like Ram can exist in a story built on patience, growth, and time, then maybe she was never meant to be easy to understand in the first place. She was meant to be understood slowly. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. This was my first real attempt at making a ReZero video, and I hope I did the series justice. It was quite a big endeavor, making a video about Ram of all people, considering just how big of a character study you can get out of all of this, but I found myself thoroughly enjoying exploring these topics. I really hope it didn't come across as me completely excusing Ram's actions or taking one side or whatever. I really didn't like to see so many people hate on her, but that might be because I'm a light novel reader and I have at least a little more context to work with. But you know, I know people reading the light novels don't exactly automatically like her better or whatever. But in my case, it definitely helped frame her in a better light. So even if this video was basically made because one of my friends started hating hard on her in the most recent season, I hope it turned out to be a nice watch, and it helped served as a basis to help understand ReZero characters as a whole. Also, just want to note, he said that he would totally date her despite all of this, so I have no clue if he likes or dislikes her anymore. But I might make more ReZero content in the future. Who knows? I would honestly need some more suggestions if people had any. I'm not exactly the most creative person in the world. It takes me months to come up with a video idea, and it takes me more months to even make the video. But yeah, that's it from me. I hope you have a great rest of your day, great rest of your night, whatever time it is, it doesn't matter. And I will see you in the next one in probably half a year, or maybe a year. Who knows at this point.